Hi, welcome to Issues with Cartoons, the show where we dissect comic books and the cartoons inspired by them. My name's Carl.
And I'm Kyle.
And this episode, we're going to continue our coverage of Earth's Mightiest Heroes. We're going to start with the second episode and kind of discuss our thoughts and feelings on it.
Yeah, so episode 2 is Thor the Mighty, which is a compilation of minisodes, just like episode 1 was. The 4 minisodes this episode covers are Thor the Mighty, The Siege of Asgard, My Brother, My Enemy, and The Isle of Silence. It was written by Michael Ryan and directed once again by Vinton Heck. Pardon me, sir. I will learn how to pronounce your name before we're done covering the show. So Michael Ryan, he worked on shows like The Real Adventures of Johnny Quest, the 03 version of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. He created a show called What a Cartoon and Wolf Boy and the Everything Factory. And he's written 8 episodes of Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes across the run. So his name will come back a few times.
Be hearing from him.
Yeah, we'll be hearing from you, Michael. But yeah, so this is the Thor episode.
It really is. This episode doesn't really even feature the other Avengers. It's very much a standalone Thor episode.
Yeah, kind of what I thought about episode 1, where the mini episodes were kind of the Iron Man ones. Were the first 3 were Iron Man minisodes, and then the last one was a Nick Fury episode. And
definitely.
It didn't tack on to the end because it was part of the narrative that was in the other 3 minisodes. But this one definitely was like, it's all Thor all the time, baby, and it's just going to be about this particular adventure. So what is your experience with Thor as a character? Have you read much Thor? Have you...
just
you've seen the movies.
To make it clear to the audience, I've read the classic like reprints of Avengers. So like some of the early appearances, like Avengers 1. I read some of the Avengers stuff when it tied over with X-Men. I remember some of the crossovers and stuff. I know Rogue's first appearance is in an Avengers annual.
Right.
But I'm trying to think. Oh yeah, the Jason Aaron, the God Butcher stuff I've read of Thor. Just because
man, with Esad Ribic art?
Yeah.
So good.
Because one of my friends recommended it to me, and they were just like, you have to read this comic. And I read it. I wasn't disappointed. I can see why those issues are so highly regarded. But that's pretty much my experience with Thor. I wouldn't say I'm a huge Thor fan. I did read all the Ultimates, too.
Yeah, okay, sure.
I'll say that, too.
Yeah, I think that was probably outside of Avengers. Ultimates is probably where my Thor... diet mostly lives. Thor is a character who I know I would love if I just dove in.
Right.
He's had a lot of very storied runs. I mean, Jack Kirby did probably outside of Fantastic Four. I'm going to probably have to fact check myself on this, but I think Jack Kirby's contribution to Marvel was probably mostly in Captain America, Fantastic Four, and then Thor, I think, is probably one that he was on a lot longer, because other books he would hand off to other artists, like X-Men, famously, he only did like 9 or 10 issues. And then same with...
the Hulk.
The Hulk is another one.
The Hulk, he did like the first 6
right,
or so.
Yeah,
but...
so he would like kind of get it going and then leave.
Yeah.
And we talked about Nick Fury last time, and he had a very good run on Nick Fury, but even compared to something like Captain America, he didn't do quite as much. But I guess with Thor, he's very much associated with the Silver Age Thor. And then Walt Simonson famously had a storied run. And then Jurgens and John Romita Jr. were on the book when I started reading.
That run was memorable. I remember all the solicitations for that and stuff.
And then most recently, Jason Aaron has had kind of probably one of the longer runs of the teens and 20s of as far as contemporary Marvel Comics
It's
go.
a lot of issues.
Yeah, so anyway, as far as Thor adaptations go, I don't actually think at this point in time there had been many Thor adaptations. There was the 60s Marvel Superhero Hour kind of basically proto-motion comics that they did in the 60s.
Yeah.
There was a Thor one. It has a theme song. It's hilarious. And then he was in an episode of The Incredible Hulk TV show, or maybe there was a
Oh yeah, the TV show.
or maybe
David
it was
Banner.
Or maybe there was even it was a TV movie associated with the show. I honestly don't know if it was an episode.
I think I've seen that, but they also had Daredevil as well.
Yeah, and I've seen stills from both of those. I'd love to watch them sometime, but I've not seen them. And then I think I know he cameoed, a non-speaking cameo in the X-Men animated series. I think he cameoed.
Checks out.
He might have cameoed in the Avengers United We Stand cartoon. I don't hold me to that. Anyway, the point being, whereas like Iron Man, who we talked about last time, had a show in the 60s, he had a show in the 90s, he even had a show in the early 2000s. You know, at this point, Iron Man had a movie.
Thor.
Audiences were becoming familiar with Iron Man, where Thor, this is kind of maybe the longest adaptation he had up to this point.
Is Thor the redheaded stepchild of the Marvel Universe?
Oh, I hope not.
Well, I don't think so anymore, but maybe in the 90s a little bit.
And guess what color Thor's hair is in actual Norse mythology?
Is it red?
It's red.
Well, learning something new every day
on
this show.
All right, so this episode, we meet Thor, we meet Jane Foster, we meet the Wrecking Crew as the primary antagonist for the first mini-sode. And then it moves into the Frost Giants and Loki.
Right.
And we get kind of like a flashback at the end that kind of shows kind of the real machinations that are happening behind the scenes. So, what are some of your impressions?
I think it's cool that it's setting the stage for future stories, obviously. Mm-hmm. I wasn't expecting this watching the episode. Like, I thought we were going to kick it right to the Avengers, but this is very much setting up Thor for future Avengers stories. I also think of that first Avengers crossover where Loki is the antagonist.
Yeah, I think Avengers #1.
Yeah, in Avengers #1, and it totally feels to me like that is being set up, and I think that's where this is going to go. That's just my guess. I haven't, like I said in the last episode, I haven't seen this before, so this is all just my fresh perspective on it.
Yeah, but wouldn't that be great if that were true? And the character designs, again, just to talk real quick about those, very much pulling from Kirby, looking at those original Asgardian designs, with some tweaks here and there. We had watched the episode before we started recording, and we were talking about the helmet that Thor wears. And if you look at his helmet in the Kirby books, it's pretty much just a hat with wings.
It is.
But you were talking about that helmet and kind of the design of it.
Yeah, like when he stands at his side, there's like part of the helmet that comes down to cover the nose that I thought was really cool. And they have like a cool perspective of like a side view of Thor where it's more three-dimensional than that original design.
I think those like cheekbone guards that they have on it, and like kind of like the circular things that the wings come out of. I feel like that, like enlarging those, really kind of gives it. We talk about the silhouette of the show, and talk about how strong the designs are. Again, Tom Perkins is the character designer on the show, and
it's a great job,
really great job, and really stylistic and really strong. I mean, we talk when you hear people talk about character design, silhouette is a principle of design, and he gives each character. If you look at like when they're all in the Asgardian throne room, when Odin is reprimanding Loki, and you see them all lined up, all the Warriors 3 and Balder and Thor and Sif, they're all different sizes and shapes, and just they look so good as an ensemble.
Did a great job. He plays with scale and size too, and each character has an individual look. It's great. It's great animation. It's a great job
for sure. All right, couple of random facts to drop for you about this episode. So Thor is voiced by Rick D. Wasserman, who was Basil Karlo in the Arkham City video games. He was comedian in Watchmen Chapter 1, which is coming out, if it's not out already. Are you familiar with that project?
I did see the preview for that. I'm a huge Watchmen fan, so I'll probably check it out.
He was the narrator in the Werewolf by Night special that came out, if not last Halloween, then the Halloween before.
That was an underrated project. I don't hear that one talked about enough. And
they need to do more of them, and they need to let Michael Giacchino direct more.
I know.
Sinestro in Green Lantern, Beware My Power. And then he was also Techno in Avengers Assemble, Hulk in Planet Hulk, and Radioactive Man in the Black Panther animated project that was based off the John Romita Jr.
Oh, is it the motion comic thing you showed me?
The glorified motion comic.
John Romita Jr., Marvel staple at this point.
Yeah. And so, what else do we have? So, he was the voice of Thor. We also had first appearances of Jane Foster, voiced by...
Natalie Portman?
Wouldn't that be great?
I wish.
There's Carrie Walgren, who I think... I'll have to double check this. I think she was the voice of Maria Hill in the last episode. But she was also...
interesting. Dual roles.
Yeah.
Okay.
You actually see that a few times. I think she's also the voice of the Enchantress in this episode.
Nice.
And then she's also the voice of Zatanna in the DC Superhero Girl show. She's Ma Kent in My Adventures with Superman. Lots of different things. I could list them all for you, but I won't.
Right.
To you. And then we have the Wrecker and Thunderball, Piledriver, and Bulldozer, characters from the Wrecking Crew. Wrecker actually debuted in Thor. Wrecking Crew came about 6 or 7 years later in the Defenders comic. So Wrecker, I believe, is a Lee Kirby character, whereas the rest of the Wrecking Crew are Lin Wein and Sal Buscema. And then you also get to meet Loki, who is voiced by Graham McTavish, who was most notably I forget which dwarf he was in the Hobbit movies, but he was
one of the he was in the Hobbit films. I've only watched those once, I'm not gonna lie.
I love the original Lord of the Rings trilogy. I've only seen the Hobbit trilogy one time. But he's featured in that. I thought his voice was fantastic in this episode. I think Thor and Loki were both very strong voice performances.
Oh, for sure. I don't have any complaints there watching it. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, honestly, the voice acting across the board in this show. One thing I need to look up is who the voice director is, because I don't know that off the top of my head.
There hasn't been anything jarring to me.
No.
Like, sometimes when I'm watching these animated adaptations of comic books, they're so precious to me. And, like, it's gotta fit, for a while when they were doing those DC animated movies and they had someone besides Kevin Conroy, it bothered me, and that hasn't really happened with this show. I think all the voices fit the characters.
I agree, and I think sometimes even when you don't have Andrea Romano on those projects, you can tell.
Well, it played a big hand in making that all successful, for sure.
A couple more voice actors I want to point out to you. Nolan North, who you might know as the voice of Deadpool in video games and animated projects, was the voice of Balder and Piledriver. And then Nika Fetterman was the voice of Lady Sif, who was also Ventress in the Clone Wars.
The Clone Wars.
And then the big one that I asked you about was Odin. The voice of Odin is Clancy Brown.
Oh, Lex Luthor.
Mr. Krabs himself, Clancy Brown.
He's legendary.
With one of the best voices in Hollywood.
He's got a great voice.
Incredible voice. And the presence that his voice gives Odin is perfect.
It's almost like James Earl Jones level of just like it pulls you in. Like that lower register, Yeah,
it really kind of... You're right. You just kind of feel like enveloped by it.
Yeah. There's presence in the voice.
Yep. All right. So anything you want to talk about as far as the plot of this episode goes? I know you had some thoughts.
It's very straightforward. It's very much like, here's Asgard, here's Thor, here's the Frost Giants, and like let's have a battle and an adventure. And it sets up a few things possibly for future episodes. Like, there's an Easter egg where Loki turns into the leader for a moment and stuff, and I'm just wondering if that's going to pay off or what's going on with that.
I will just mention two things. The device the Wrecking Crew tries to steal is a gamma emitter, which I couldn't find any references in the comics, but obviously tied to the Hulk, so the leader showing up is obviously a play to that. I will say Michael Ryan, one of the next episodes he writes is called Gamma World. So we'll just consider that a tease.
I wonder what that could be.
The voice, yeah, who could that involve? The voice of the leader was Jeffrey Combs, who was he was in Star Trek. I knew Jeffrey Combs' voice from Justice League Unlimited.
Wait, hold
he was
on.
the voice of, do you know?
I'm not sure.
The Question.
And
My
Justice League?
favorite iteration of The Question is the JLU version, which is very different from the comics, but it's much more like kind of a composite of Question and Rorschach, and he does.
Yeah, I was about to say that. He's Rorschach.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much, but it's a very good take on it.
And they gave Huntress some time.
Yeah.
I wish they gave Huntress more time. I mean, that's a Batman character from like when I was a kid that I really enjoyed, and
those
I like
episodes
seeing
of
that.
those two are so good.
It's fun. It's a lot of fun.
But yeah, I do agree where like if you're out of context and this is the only episode of this show you would watch, and the leader just kind of dips in and out, it is strange. But we kind of talked last time, I think, about how this show is very serialized, especially early on.
Yeah,
where it's not built for being episodic and being viewed in isolation. It's built to be watched from the beginning and kind of build over time, and they plant seeds that grow and change and create storylines that you follow later down the road.
I can see the seeds of continuity being planted, and I have a feeling that's the reason why the fans love this show so much. Like there's some great Easter eggs and there's great continuity, and if there's one thing comic fans enjoy, it's good continuity. We love it when you reference previous things and tie things together.
We sure love good continuity.
Yeah,
that's right. So
is there continuity?
Right. Yeah, just is it at all related to what I just read?
It's an illusion.
But I also just love to have a good time. So the other couple of cameos you see are we see the Warriors 3, who don't really have much of a role.
No, and they don't even introduce them. So like if you didn't, when I talk about Easter eggs, it's things like that, because it's like you aren't explicitly told it's those characters. They just show up and perform some battles. And
if I never told you that was the Warriors 3 to you, it's just another group of Asgardians, right?
Yeah.
Same with, honestly, Balder plays a part near the end. And I actually have a little nitpick about that part, but we'll get to that. And then Sif is in there a little bit.
Enchantress got some time.
Enchantress features very heavily in that last mini-sode where she kind of facilitates Loki's plot.
Yeah.
Which obviously involves manipulating Thor to go out into the open to distract him while he sends the Frost Giants into Asgard while Odin is preparing for the Odin sleep.
But Odin also kind of kicks Thor out of Asgard. He's like, and Thor, they have a little bit of where they butt their heads, and Thor says he's going back to Earth.
Yeah, and we mentioned a lot of the parallels between Iron Man, MCU Iron Man, and the Episode 1, and I actually think there are some parallels, not as strong, but there are some parallels to maybe Act 1 of the Thor film from 2011.
Oh, there definitely are.
To this episode. Certainly the Frost Giants invading Asgard because Loki manipulates events so that
that's
Thor's
the
away.
Dark World,
right? Essentially. And while Odin is in his Odin sleep, Loki capitalizes on attacking Asgard while Thor is away from Earth because he manipulated events to get Thor away from Asgard. Very similar parallels. I have a feeling if we were to read a lot of early Thor books, and we've read some in preparation for this episode, I think that theme of Loki manipulating things so that he can capitalize on Thor being away, I think that's pretty common. In fact, I've not read the first appearance of the Wrecker, but I do think the Wrecker has an origin tied to Loki giving him power to stand up to Thor to distract Thor.
Did you want more time for Jane Foster? Do you feel like she had like a quick little scene at the beginning? Did you want more of her? Yeah. Did you want more time?
I'll tell you what. Yes, I'll tell you what. What's interesting to me about Jane. Jane is a perfect example to me of how you can tell this was made before the first Thor movie.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
I think what this exposes where in the timeline of the MCU we are sitting in as far as context goes. Because in the film with Natalie Portman, she is a scientist. She's one of the dozens of scientists in the MCU who's studying like astrophysical occurrences. And Thor gets wrapped into events around her experiments and stuff.
Right.
So, in the comics, she's a nurse because Thor is really Don Blake, who is a physician. And so that's how they know each other.
Right, and he transforms into Thor.
He transforms into Thor.
Puts his staff on the ground.
In the second segment of the show, we'll talk about that appearance and kind of that situation. But that whole situation is done away with in both the movie and in this show. Don Blake is nowhere to be found. It's all just Thor being a fish out of water, which seems to be the way that Thor is played.
Let me just say, we talked about the Ultimate Universe a lot, which was an imprint of Marvel in the early 2000s by Joe Quesada, Brian Michael Bendis, Mark Millar, and it was like a relaunch of Marvel. This version of Thor is comic book Thor. The film version with Chris Hemsworth is very much the Ultimate Universe.
Great point, and I'll even say that perhaps the reason Don Blake is done away with and why the physician transforming into a god angle is done away with is maybe the tiny little bit of ultimate influence on this show, because we know that there's an ultimate influence.
Yeah.
But perhaps that's where that originates from. But you're right, the MCU version certainly early on is much more ultimate Thor than 616.
Yeah, and I don't know who made that decision to they definitely put their foot down with Earth Mightiest Heroes, and they were like, this is going to be the Jack Kirby version of this character.
Every design, even the Asgard itself. I mean,
and that was great. I mean, I love there was some heavy references to Jack Kirby's work in the costumes in this episode, which as a comics fan, I really appreciated.
Man, absolutely. That rainbow bridge looked gorgeous. And honestly, the throne room looked great. We were talking about how ornate the backgrounds looked. The Thor characterization I really liked. Yeah. He was kind of playful, but also very serious. That line where I think it's Wrecker has Jane Foster in a hold, and he says, "Don't you have any honor, or have you no honor?" And he says, "Not one bit." And then Thor says, "Then you should be used to being attacked from behind," or the concept of attacking from behind, and that's when Mjolnir smashes him in the back of the head.
He had some cool animations with Mjolnir. Yeah. He spins it around, he flies in the air, he smashes buildings. They animated Thor very well. I was impressed by that, especially for an older show. Yeah. I mean, we're talking about a show from 2010, and it looks better than some newer stuff I've seen come out.
Anyway, yes, I agree. And honestly, the hammer twirl is kind of essential. If you get that right, you can get Thor visually pretty right. We as fans will allow a lot if you can get that. It's kind of like Captain America's shield. If you can get the shield slinging part down,
that's all we want.
Yeah, visually, your action scenes are written down. You got to figure it out now. All right. Any other kind of things you want to talk about with this episode? We get a lot of seeds planted, like you say. We get some kind of machinations in the background.
Yeah, Loki's manipulating things, and he gets imprisoned at the end as well.
Yeah. And
he's just plotting. And you can clearly see that, and it's not told to you. It's a great example of show don't tell.
Absolutely.
Show your characters do anything. I don't need to be told Loki, you could have had Odin be Loki's been sent away, and we don't get to see, but we literally see Loki sitting in this prison, and he's just plotting.
That device of the flashbacks to show you he's right where he wants to be.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna bring up my only nitpick with this episode, is when you see the flashbacks and Loki is disguised as Balder, and he's telling Odin Thor is mingling with mortals on Midgard, and he's with a woman named Jane Foster, and then he walks away and you find out that's Loki, and he's planting that seed in Odin's head that Thor is not being a dutiful prince of Asgard.
Mm-hmm.
But then when he's reprimanding Loki later, Odin says to Thor, Balder told me that you've been mingling with the mortals. And Balder's in the scene with him.
Uh-huh.
And if I were in a meeting and my boss said, "Hey, Kyle said that you've been up to no good and not doing your job," I would just be like, "I never said that." I don't know.
Thor doesn't defend himself enough? Is that what you're getting at?
I'm saying that Baldur didn't speak up and say, wait, that might have been Loki disguised as me. I don't know. Again, it's a nitpick.
Oh, he lets the situation just play out.
Yeah, so, but other than that, I thought it was a really strong, very Avengers-y, very Marvel-y episode with lots of Kirby action and lots of Kirby designs. And
I love we got a standalone Thor episode. Like, Thor doesn't get enough time. Like, in media outside of, the films, obviously, like, Thor never really got his time. And this episode gives us some good time with Thor.
Yeah, and I'll even say, I feel like the Jack Kirby Thor doesn't get a lot of play, even classic. In the films. And it's so epic with a capital E. And it's honestly a big part of the Kirby lore and the Kirby history. We were kind of talking about how Thor and the Norse gods of Asgard, the way Kirby designs them, shares a lot of DNA with the Fourth World.
Yeah.
And I think there's like this through line with Asgard and New Genesis and the Eternals and Captain Victory and the Galactic Rangers. There's this kind of design thread that Kirby kind of follows in this sort of narrative, like epic, that I feel like is there for fans if they want it. And I love that element of Thor gets its time to shine in an adaptation, and it's not all Ultimate Thor all the time.
Yeah, I think the closest thing I've seen as far as like a homage to like Jack Kirby's like design of the costumes is maybe the Inhumans film. Had like a lot of like
the TV show, the Inhumans or the Eternals movie.
The Eternals. I'm sorry.
Listen,
I'm sorry.
Don't get your secret societies with superpowers confused, Carl.
They're both Jack Kirby. I mixed them up. I'm sorry, but yeah, I mean, I haven't seen anything like the Eternals film.
Yeah, there's a little bit of it in Ragnarok, but I neglected to mention a couple of Thor adaptations that we may want to visit sometime.
Okay, let's hear them.
Tales of Asgard, I think it's called, is like an anthology.
I've seen that.
Have you? I've not.
I've actually seen that.
And then Hulk Versus has a sequence with Wolverine and then another sequence with Thor. I'm actually wondering, because I know that some people that worked on Earth's Mightiest Heroes worked on that movie, and I'm interested. Maybe we can do some research and find out if there's an overlap in the production crew.
The voice actors. Is Chris Yost involved?
Yeah. So anyway, love this episode. I'm excited for more Thor to come. I do think he's a character who I'd love to learn more about, read more. That's one of the things when we come back from the break and talk about this comic. These two comics that we read in prep for this, I think it'll be fun to talk about.
Yeah, we'll be making comparisons throughout the show to various comic books and kind of comparing, like last episode we did, Iron Man's first appearance, and that kind of correlated with the episode. So we'll be doing that throughout all, 52 episodes?
52. We are on episode 2 out of 52.
We only have 50 more episodes to go.
That's it, guys.
That's it.
Yeah, I'm sorry it's going by so fast. All right, well, let's go to break, and when we come back, we'll talk comics. All right, welcome back. We are here now to talk about the issues portion of Issues with Cartoons, because we have issues, and those issues are Journey into Mystery 83 and Journey into Mystery 85. Today, let's start first with Journey into Mystery 83, because it comes before 85, which is the first appearance of the most exciting superhero of all time, Carl.
It says it on the cover in really big font.
The Mighty Thor. With honestly really strong cover by Jack Kirby. I remember seeing this cover in like the 5 Fabulous Decades of Marvel and stuff like that. So I've always seen this cover, but it's a good figure drawing of Kirby.
It is.
with those cool rock men, those
Great
guys from
pose.
Saturn. Yeah.
They look like rock monsters from the Easter Island.
Yeah.
Like if the Easter Island heads
you know Kirby had National Geographic up into that page. Yeah.
Had bodies. I mean, the heads look like the Easter Island heads.
Yeah, that's
like personified.
a great connection, honestly. And really, on the cover, and I was going to wait to talk about this until we get in the issue, but you see the hammer twirl effect immediately, and
that's a great point.
It creates the language of Thor before you even open the book. Like, this is that's a staple of the visual language of Thor comics, which is pretty cool.
You hear that, everybody? There's some hammer twirling in this. There's some Mjolnir action.
Mjolnir. Although, can I tell you a fun fact? This is my fun fact about this.
What you got?
So, I don't know where he got the word Uru, but they call it the Uru hammer, not Mjolnir, because they didn't know the name of the hammer in mythology. It wasn't until later that someone told whoever was writing the book, oh wait, that hammer is called Mjolnir.
Interesting.
Yeah, I'll see if I can find out who figured all that out, but Uru is like the metal that created the hammer. Anyway, you won't see the name Mjolnir in that issue of Thor, I guess is what I'm saying. Writers were Stan Lee and Larry Lieber. I think this is coming from marvel.fandom.com. There are actually no credits listed in the story on Marvel Unlimited.
I noticed that. I opened the first page and looked to see, and it wasn't there.
And it's so interesting because Lee has sort of prided himself on the credits. We watched a documentary the other day where they interview Stan Lee, and he says, "Oh, I never let anybody touch the credits. I love doing the credits." Like he always wanted to do the credits. He had fun doing them. So it's interesting. It makes me wonder, since this is from Journey into Mystery, which was an anthology. Most Marvel books at that time were anthologies. So there are actually probably 2 or 3 other stories in this issue that we're not covering. But I wonder if maybe there was a table of contents page, like on the inside cover or something, that had all the credits. Or maybe it's just maybe we're moving from the era where they never credited anybody to where they start highlighting the creators.
We won't know till Marvel puts out a facsimile edition, or whatever's in the archive.
It's already out there, I bet.
Maybe it's in a trade or an omnibus or something.
Listen, maybe at an auction you can get.
I can't talk about that yet.
No, you can't. So anyway, I'm assuming, based on what we saw in the credits that were in Tales of Suspense 39, I'm assuming it's the same thing where Stan Lee did the plot, Larry Lieber did the scripting. Jack Kirby, this is our first Jack Kirby book that we're covering. He didn't do the 2 issues that we featured last.
Right, it was all
episode.
about Jim Steranko.
It was Jim Steranko and Don Heck were the artists then. This is Jack Kirby, inked by Joe Sinnott. And lettered by Artie Simek, with colors, and this is someone I want to learn more about, Stan Goldberg. I will have to put a pin in that and maybe learn more about him later. But I believe Stan Goldberg did all the coloring for early Marvel comics.
Interesting.
But Joe Sinnott, real quick, was a long-time Kirby inker. His most famous contribution is Fantastic Four. He inked Fantastic Four well beyond Kirby into the early 80s. Very accomplished inker. Influenced by Take a Drink, Terry and the Pirates. Had
again.
I mean, people from that era, Terry and the Pirates is one of the preeminent adventure strips. It doesn't get talked about a lot now because it's not like Flash Gordon that had a movie adaptation and a cartoon show and all that stuff. It's not like even the Phantom, which I think has some place in history as being one of the early costume characters. Yeah. Terry and the Pirates was just a very well done adventure strip by a very accomplished artist. And I think if you were an artist of that generation, you had to be watching that stuff. Because you hear Hal Foster's name brought up a lot. You hear Alex Raymond's name brought up a lot. And I feel like Milton Caniff is right up in there with artists like Jack Kirby and Don Heck and John Romita. They were reading that stuff when they were young.
It's influential.
Absolutely. So anyway, he was another guy who came into the Marvel fold back when it was Atlas Comics, and he worked on monster books and stuff like that. As far as this book goes, the art in this, I love Jack Kirby. And I could talk all day about Jack Kirby.
I could too. We could do a whole podcast about just Jack Kirby, and I could just talk about it.
That would be amazing. But like the figure work, the storytelling, the dynamism. I mean, these are all things that are associated with Kirby. But that kind of just larger than life expressionistic way of conveying action, conveying character, conveying acting.
I'm gonna say this, and this I don't feel like it's hyperbolic, but Jack Kirby invented the language of superhero comics.
You might even call him the king of comics.
Yeah, and there's a reason he has that nickname. His body of work is expansive. I mean, he even got drafted into the war, and they were still printing his comics while he was at war. And then when he returned, he continued to produce work.
I think, I might get the page count wrong. I think when he moved to DC in the 70s, I think his contract was like 15 pages a week. Can you imagine? 15 pages. Can you imagine?
He's like a mangaka. He really is. Honestly, he sits back. Like, his mangakas like make maybe 20 pages a week, at least. And so like he's on the schedule with that.
And it's just so good. It's all so good.
It's all solid.
This story is going to kind of deviate a lot from what we watched in episode 2 of Avengers: Earth's Mightiest Heroes. This
cannot be more different.
This is the Stone Men from Saturn, and the first splash of Thor. The legend has come true. By the will of the gods, I am alive. I am invincible. I am Thor. Beautifully made. There are 2 inset panels, and it's this frail figure, Dr. Don Blake, an American vacation in Europe. It's just this little shot of this man just looking at the Norwegian mountains. And then the next panel is just a spaceship, it says silently lands behind him. I just think it's wild.
I feel like Kirby spent all of his time that day drawing that pose of Thor, because it really is great. There's some great foreshortening where like the hammer is coming towards you. Honestly, and that's like the dynamic poses I'm talking about when like Kirby invented the language of comics. His poses are very dynamic.
Incredible work, man. And I don't know. There's so much to say. One thing about Jack Kirby as a person is one of his interests. We had mentioned you had slipped up Inhumans and Eternals earlier.
Yeah, I did.
And part of the reason, no, but I only bring that up. I'm not going to point out all the mistakes you made. I only bring that up because Kirby comes back to certain themes and elements in his work, going all the way back to when he was in the Golden Age. But one of those things is gods among men hiding amongst us.
Right.
And Inhumans is a version of that. Eternals is explicitly a version of that.
New Gods
is explicitly a version. And then Thor, before all of those things, was an example of that. And this is, you can tell reading this, he was into it. Like, you can tell he really...
Like... Kirby isn't just an artist. He has concepts behind these characters he's drawing, whether the writer embraces that or not. Right. Kirby is bringing not just art to the table, but he's bringing a lot of mythology and a lot of original concepts. I mean, that's the thing about New Gods. It's so dense.
It is
with ideas.
It's a new idea on every page almost. And I feel like that's Kirby just exploding. My favorite anecdote about Jack Kirby is Roz, his wife, had to drive him everywhere because when he would try to drive, he would daydream about stories and he would wreck his car, and so he couldn't drive. And it's so funny because I'll have versions where I'll miss an exit because
I do that.
I'm daydreaming.
I've done that.
I have thankfully, knock on wood, but I've thankfully never had any kind of accident because I'm dreaming up what the story of the New Gods might be. But
typical artist just daydreaming a lot.
Yeah, I mean, just an engine of creativity in between those ears.
Charles Schultz talks about that, how he lives in his head and stuff. In the few interviews I've seen with him, he talks about that, how he just kind of disassociates and drifts off.
It has to be common amongst creative people.
I think it is.
Particularly cartoonists. I'm not even just artists or writers, but like specifically writer artists, which I know he's credited as an artist here. We know that Jack Kirby is a writer artist in practice, and certainly explicitly in his later work. He's
definitely
a writer artist. I wonder if with cartoonists who are constantly thinking about stories visually, if that doesn't happen just constantly, like all the time, where they get sucked into the world that they're trying to imagine, that they're building, and that they have to convey to you with pen and paper later. I imagine it has to happen a lot.
Yeah.
But you can see just kind of in the way that he draws these Norwegian scenes and these action scenes. One of my favorite panels, and I don't know if he doesn't do it as much in
the transition when he picks up the hammer. That part's so cool.
Inky blots, like shout out to Joe Sinnott, like for conveying that.
Yeah.
These beautiful inky blotches.
Had some cool textures there.
Just incredible, but
there's some great sequential pages or moments like that in this book. Actually, throughout it, like Kyle's showing me this page where Thor lifts this rock, and it almost feels animated the way it is. And same with Thor's transformation.
Yeah.
When he picks up the hammer, it's very sequential, one moment to the next.
So you can read this issue on Marvel Unlimited, but if you don't have that, or Comixology Unlimited, or if you don't have access to they might. Comixology Unlimited, is that still a thing? I don't even know.
I don't know either.
Anyway, on Amazon Kindle. But if you don't have access to this issue, Don Blake is this meek doctor, physician who's vacationing in Europe, and this alien spacecraft lands, and
I love it. It's so
giant
60s.
Stone men of Saturn drop. My favorite scene is when Don is sneaking behind a rock, and he's like, it's them, the aliens. They're just as he said, they were men of stone. And you hear one of them say, remember, death to any who discover our presence. And the very next thing Don Blake does is steps on a branch, and someone says, wait, an Earthling is over there. He's seen us. Like, immediately after, like, hey, we're going to kill the next dude who sees us. And he's just like, snap. Anyway.
I love when Kirby draws monsters, too. Like, these rock monsters are so fun. And there's a monster later on in the book.
Yes.
And, like, I just read it, and I, like, gasped at the monster. I love when Kirby draws creatures. He draws so many good ones in Fantastic Four, too.
Yeah.
You know?
And it's funny, because this was in 1962? Let me check my notes. 1962, which is just at
predating that, yeah.
Very beginning of Marvel. And before Marvel, the company was Atlas Comics, and Atlas's big output primarily was monster comics with like monsters with weird names like Fin Fang Foom and Gore.
Yeah.
All
those characters.
Big, and Groot originated in that era. And Kirby did a lot of that. And
Kirby
monster
made Groot.
books were a big thing with Atlas at the time. And I've even seen things where, like, if you look at the cover of Fantastic Four #1,
the Mole Man's monster.
That giant monster, and having Thing as a member of the Fantastic Four was almost like a safety net for, like, in case, well, maybe superheroes aren't quite back in fashion. Maybe if this isn't really what audiences want, we'll just make it a monster book.
I'm going to make the point while we're here, like that first issue of Fantastic Four is really more their pulp characters, and they don't have costumes yet. They don't have the Fantastic Four costumes, so they aren't really superheroes, and they're fighting monsters. It's very pulp inspired.
Honestly,
at that time.
And really, like, having a god character fighting aliens,
it's fun.
It's so fun, and it does feel a little pulpy. Like, it you know, you got this wild-looking spaceship that... I don't know where Kirby gets his inspirations for these things, but it's wild to look at. I mean, it almost looks like the bottom of an iron with, like, I don't know.
Well, I used an iron as a reference. I mean, look at the shape of it.
I know. Well, it's so fascinating. And anyway, so Don's trying to hide from these aliens, and he sees this cave that's blocked by a boulder, and this poor, frail guy's like, if I can move this boulder, then maybe I can hide. Can't move it. He sees this gnarled stick, and he's like, maybe I can... move it with this stick, because the secret passage that he decides isn't good enough to hide in opens up, and he takes a stick, and then he's so mad that he can't open it that he just whacks it against the boulder, and he turns into Thor. And one thing so that's when you see this beautiful transition with these inky lines, with these big splotches that are almost like proto Kirby dots. But I kind of think Kirby dots were probably part of his language at this point. They're not in here, but I'd be interested to know where this sits with Kirby dots in his.
Can someone tell us when the first Kirby dot was? I would love to know that.
I would love to.
Yeah, let me know that.
Following that thread through his career would be interesting. But one thing I want to talk about with this issue is Don Blake and kind of the persona of Don Blake being just in the body with the powers of Thor. Whereas later, I feel like you get more Thor speak, and you get lots of theys and thous, and lots of bombastic kind of Shakespearean talk, and you kind of get more of Thor as its own discrete personality. But in this story, which is very early, obviously, it's like this ordinary man hits a stick against a rock, and he gets the body and the powers of a god.
Yeah.
Because he talks like Don Blake, he acts like Don Blake.
It's no different than Shazam. It's like a persona that he becomes.
And it's interesting that you bring up Shazam, because in the early Captain Marvel, like Fawcett comics, they were discrete personalities. And later, in like more modern retellings, they become one person.
One person, yeah.
So
makes it more
it's
interesting.
Just an interesting thing to consider. Eventually, in Thor 150, they retcon it so that Odin actually wiped Thor's memory and transformed him into Don Blake, and so Don Blake's been Thor the whole time.
So they retcon it.
Yeah, back in the 60s.
It's interesting.
So interesting. What did you think? Did you pick up on the weird rules that they created for the hammer?
You know, the thing that sticks with me at Hammer is like the writing on it when he initially picks it up, and he's like, "Whoever shall hold this shall hold it."
Odin wrote in modern English.
yeah, and that line gets repeated a lot though, like in the Thor mythos, you know. And I think even he says it in the film, doesn't he? He's
yeah, when he sends Thor away and he whispers it and creates like a Nordic rune.
Yeah.
Which is a little more. It's less anachronistic than just what they did. But like some weird things that I don't think lasted very long. 60-second rule. So if he doesn't have the hammer in his hand for 60 seconds,
he has to hold it. Was one of the things.
If he hits the hammer twice, it starts the storm. If he hits it 3 times, it stops the storm.
That's how my microwave works.
I've never heard that rule until I read this issue. I don't think it lasted very long.
They did not maintain that there.
No.
Can you imagine that in modern continuity?
Imagine Chris Hemsworth like tap.
Yeah, they're like having civil war, and like Captain America's like running for Thor, and he's like, "Hold on, I gotta tap my stick on the ground. Hold on a sec."
It's just so. It's very throwbacky. It's very 60s. Like I feel like they felt like they had to give some rules to these things. Even the physics of the way he flies is twirling the hammer, throwing it, and just hanging on for dear life. Like that's how he flies. Like it's just interesting. And then, like you said, the Saturn men create this hologram of this amazing dragon monster that looks like he's from an Atlas comic.
That's the one I was talking about earlier. It's just that typical Kirby monster design, but it's great.
Yeah,
he's so good at drawing monsters.
That scaly body, it's just really impressive.
I think monsters are fun to draw because you don't have to follow anatomy.
No rules.
It's like that one thing where you can just be like, you know what, that shoulder doesn't line up with that one. Okay, it's fine. It's a monster. It's fun to draw.
Perfect for Kirby, who's very much he's all about the impression of something. He wants to be expressive. The anatomy is just kind of a bonus.
Right. If he nails that or not.
Then you get this mechano monster at the very end of the book that Thor
in 2 panels.
In 2 panels.
Why is that not enough time? Like almost an afterthought.
Right. But it's enough to scare the crap out of these Saturn men, and they're like, "We better go." Like this guy's not gonna.
Just for the record, Saturn men do not like robots.
Yeah,
they don't play nice.
They don't like you breaking their stuff.
Yeah, so are the Rockmen Republicans and then the space thing?
We're not doing this, Bob. I do want to just drastically pivot real fast. Korg from Thor Ragnarok is a Saturn man that same
Okay.
character. And in fact, I think one of the characters in this book, Gore, I think is related to Korg. That could be wrong. My recollection is there's some connection between Korg and this issue.
I see.
And when Korg shows up in the Planet Hulk event in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, this story is referenced again. So it doesn't go away. I just noticed, not to call out Artie Simic, but do you notice anything about that last panel?
I don't. What's
Thor has 2 R's.
Oh, it does. Yeah.
So anyway, they were working fast.
Hey, all these early comics are some kind of kink or something, and the monthly schedule. I mean, like, can you imagine?
Right. Peter Palmer. There's a reference for some of you. The last thing I want to say about this issue that made me laugh was the army shows up as the Saturn men are leaving. They finally get there, and they say, "Look, the invaders are flying away. But why? What could have driven them off? I don't know. There's no one in sight except that lame passerby with a gnarled old cane." Well, it's a cinch. That skinny gent isn't Earth's secret weapon. Just
laying on thick.
Weird. Like, leave that poor old man alone. Like, he's just hanging out in Europe. You don't have to call him out like that.
I think from just like purely a historical context, like Marvel fans should check this out though. There's a lot of firsts here, just like the first Iron Man appearance. Like you have the first Thor using his hammer. You know, a lot of things that are still in the lore.
And honestly,
are in this issue.
Anytime you get Joe Sinnott inking Jack Kirby,
the art alone is worth the read.
And we haven't talked much about Larry Lieber or Stan Lee. Obviously, they contributed, but I do feel like just knowing Kirby's love of mythology, this has
comes across.
And anytime, this is just kind of a standard rule. And honestly, I should have said this when I was talking about the credits. When we talk about Lee Kirby collaborations, it's almost better to just say this was made by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, instead of saying written by and drawn by. I feel like that doesn't capture what we're seeing as a final product. I do feel like it's both. All right, before we move on to 85, anything about 83 you want to talk about?
It's a great comic. It's worth reading. If you're a big Marvel fan, definitely check it out. And yeah, I don't really have anything else to say about it.
I need to talk about Journey into Mystery 85 because this is bonkers. Journey into Mystery 85 is the first appearance. Never before has the mighty Thor faced a foe as dangerous. After 2 appearances, he's never faced a foe this dangerous. Loki, the god of mischief.
Hyperbolic Stan Lee dialogue. We gotta have it.
Cover copy is pretty fantastic.
Yeah, we gotta have it.
But so obviously Loki, integral part into the story of Thor and the comics of Thor.
Absolutely, and this episode. I mean, we've been talking a lot of Thor and Loki.
Oh, he's almost a co-lead in the episode.
Right.
And this issue is the first time he's appeared in modern, in 616 continuity, we'll say.
Right. This is the modern interpretation of Loki.
We mentioned Atlas Comics a couple times. There actually is a previous appearance of Loki, a version of a Loki, in an Atlas comic called Venus.
Number 6,
which we are planning on covering in the future. But today we're going to stick with the Loki we know.
616.
We're talking about Tom Hiddleston. We're talking about
big yellow horns. That's what we're talking about.
Although, interestingly, in this book, and you pointed this out, and I do love it, he's got this kind of brownish hood that he has instead of the solid gold. So it kind of almost looks like a boar's head.
I almost like the variety more. There's so many of the early Marvel characters are like 2 colors. Like Doctor Doom is like green, Electro's yellow and green.
And I wonder if it was a process thing. If it's just easier to just do solid yellow for most of it, and then
it was like heroes have to be red, villains have to be, green, and these not primary colors. There was something about that.
I bet you're right. So in this issue, we get what I think might be the first appearance of Asgard. The first appearance of Loki, like we said, Heimdall. Mm-hmm. You see the back of Balder and Odin's heads at the very end. But in this issue, we open with Loki trapped in a tree, which is where we kind of left him at the end of episode 2 of
it's a cool callback. Earth Mightiest Heroes ends with Loki imprisoned within this tree, and this issue begins with that.
Yeah, and not to play ahead too much, but if you were to read Avengers #1, which I know you have, but I'm sure you don't remember
Revisit
this detail.
it for the show.
In Avengers #1, Loki is in the Island of Silence, or the Isle of Silence, which is the title of the mini episode that ends with Loki. So where Loki is in that kind of black and white monochromatic world where he can't speak, that Isle of Silence, but he's also tied to a tree. So it's interesting that it's almost like a melding of those two appearances. So right from the beginning, where we have Loki is trapped in this tree, and the rule of this particular prison is the only way he can escape is if he gets someone to weep or shed a tear for his situation. And so in true God of Mischief fashion, Heimdall walks by and Loki shakes the tree, a leaf brushes Heimdall's eye, and Heimdall sheds a tear. And so due to a technicality where that leaf wouldn't have fallen if not for Loki's situation, and Heimdall wouldn't have shed a tear if not for Loki shaking that tree, ergo, Heimdall sheds a tear because of Loki's situation. He escapes. Just absolutely absurd. It's so funny.
Loki really lucked out this time.
Loki really loves a loophole. He really loves a loophole. And so, you then see Loki checking in on Thor. He's doing the most pure, wholesome superhero thing where he's visiting kids in hospitals and keeping them entertained. And then he skips along the Rainbow Bridge to go...
Is that the first time we see it? Like the trail to Asgard?
So yeah, we see it on page 2, and then you see Loki traversing it on page 3.
I like the colors they went with on it. It's not a typical rainbow. They went with like a different color scheme.
Pastel-y almost, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep, I like that a lot. So good job, Stan Goldberg. We approve. So Loki disguises himself in a mortal form and decides to do what he does and cause some
mischief. We got to start messing with the people.
And he does what I kind of would have associated more with a Steranko effect. But
I know.
Kirby, and we love Kirby. We've talked a lot about how much we love Kirby. Kirby did a lot of experimentation.
He does. He does a lot of photo collage work later in his career.
And a lot of people talk a lot about Kirby for being the action guy and Steranko for being the experimental guy, but Kirby walked so Steranko could run as far as like doing unique things with color holds and all that stuff. And this negative effect, again, I guess I'll give. Is this Joe Sinnott again?
Joe Sinnott was the inker.
Was he the inker? This is Dick Ayers on inks.
Oh, okay.
So Dick Ayers and Jack Kirby, another longtime inker of Kirby's.
Looks like they inverse the drawing.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? Well, and it's interesting. You kind of tell it's a different inker because the transformation effect does look
it's different.
Just a little. It's not quite as blotty as
There's
the other one.
Way more action lines.
Yes.
On it, and it's definitely a different style.
But I mean, that negative effect looks really good.
It is cool.
It's very.
I almost
cool.
want to implement that.
I know.
I want to steal that.
And like, look at this, like where. Look at this part at the very end of the first chapter where you have Loki and Thor in silhouette. Almost like a partial silhouette because there's still some color in there.
I like that though. I like leaving space instead of making that like they easily could have made that just an opaque blue,
black or whatever.
But that white line around the characters adds a lot.
Really good, and it really makes it feel like a piece of pop art.
It does.
And so then Loki takes a flying carpet into the sky and gets the sun to reflect off of Thor's hammer and hypnotizes him with the reflective light.
That's not convoluted.
I don't think that is how that worked, but he's the god of mischief, so I'll give him that.
It's Star Trek science.
Yeah, exactly. So he's trying to get Thor to let go of his hammer for 60 seconds because of that strange rule. And he finally manages to do it by creating a duplicate image of Thor for Thor to hand himself the hammer. And so then Don Blake comes Don Blake again. And you okay, Carl?
I'm just a little sleepy.
That's okay. You've been hypnotized by the light reflecting off of your hammer.
Something about Thor handing a hammer to himself made me fall asleep.
Sure. So then you get this scene where guys are like trying to lift up the hammer, and then Don Blake just kind of saunters over and transforms into Thor. And the crowd is just like, where'd that skinny guy go? No one's like, wait, that guy just turned into Thor. They're just like, what happened to that dude? And then my favorite panel in the whole thing is when Loki corrals a flock of pigeons and rides them.
Hey, if you want to kill the god of thunder, get yourself a flock of pigeons.
Just get some pigeons.
That's the lesson here.
Because how on earth is a god of thunder going to stop a flock of pigeons? And so then
Loki's up to something.
Yeah, so then Loki goes to a crowded theater and tries to escape. Thor goes into what I think is a really cool sequence. Thor goes and follows him to a subway, and
it's rendered well.
Yeah, he pushes these people onto the tracks, and Thor gets under and does like a Chris Reeve Superman moment where he like pushes the tracks above the people who are on the ground, and the train just kind of coasts over them. And then in one of my favorite dialogues balloons in the whole thing, Thor's looking for Loki and he says, up there, he's brought the winged horse of a gasoline sign to life. Now he can fly again.
I really like the use of perspective in those top two panels, because you have like a 1 point perspective going back into the background of the subway, and then the very next panel is a 2 point perspective drawing of the side of this building, and the vanishing point's kind of off the page, but
with a really incredible Thor leaping into the subway track
again
jump.
Really dynamic Jack Kirby pose.
Incredible.
And yeah, it's great, and it's three-dimensional as well. Yep. It's great.
And so Thor solves the dilemma, the escaping Loki, by picking up some sections of concrete, hurling them perfectly to capture Loki and send him into the ocean, where he then ties his hammer to Loki and throws it to Asgard to return Loki to Asgard. And that's where you see the back of Odin, Balder, Tyr, and other astonished gods as Loki is delivered by hammer to Asgard. It just makes you think, if only were that easy every time.
I mean, but like Loki is rarely a physical contest. You know, it's always
That's
about
true.
his manipulations. It's always about his mind, like Avengers 1 when he brainwashes the Hulk. You know, he'll have the Hulk fight and do his dirty work. It's not about physically fighting Thor.
And you know, it's interesting because a lot of like the best hero-villain matchups are that kind of dynamic, where it's like, you know, Lex Luthor has to outsmart Superman, or, you know, like even Doctor Doom to an extent. But
it's a lot of gadgets and stuff.
Like they have to overcompensate for, like, Doom has to overcompensate being outnumbered and having guys like the Thing there, so he has to kind of outwit them and outsmart them and use his intelligence to beat them, and then the hero has to kind of problem solve his way out of it. Anyway, also Jane Foster, big Loki fan. She thinks he's dreamy, which, you know, I feel like is kind of the MCU trend now, is that Loki's like the dreamboat that everyone has a crush on. So who wouldn't?
I've talked to a few girls that like Tom Hiddleston.
Sure, I've heard that's true. Where was it where Loki is causing trouble, and in true 60s superhero, here it is. So it's at the beginning of part 2 when Loki and Thor are confronting each other, and all the, like, Thor's like, you know, it's Loki, and Loki's like, I challenge you to a fight, and some guys in the crowd are like, these guys must be nuts to take on Thor. Meanwhile, this girl off to the side says, Loki, a lovely name, and he seems so dashing and romantic. Like, guys, she could have been a little alarmed too that someone was going to attack Thor. we don't have to make every woman fall over head over heels. But anyway, that's just very typical of the time. You mentioned that.
Yeah, I mean, that's like the writing I was kind of critical of with Sue and Fantastic Four and stuff. It's like all of our superheroes have to be 6 feet. They have to be physically attractive. You know,
white,
like
blonde.
I feel like comics as a medium have come a long way since then in like giving us more representation of different types of characters, whereas these older stories just don't do that.
Yeah, and I don't know. I know that the story of Loki and Thor have been retold in modern retellings. Like there's an Esau Ribic miniseries about like everything from Loki's perspective. I don't know if it's this particular event though that has ever been retold. That'd be interesting to know. But anyway,
I mean that's why Elektra has 2 origins. You know, we like to revisit our Marvel heroes and reinvent them as we go along. You know?
Well, and yeah, there's a long storied history of that going on.
Yeah, particularly
in superhero comics. But yeah, that's all I really had to say about Journey into Mystery number 85. I don't know when Tales of Asgard. Are you familiar with Tales of Asgard?
I am not.
Okay, so Journey into Mystery, like I said, most Marvel issues back in the 60s were anthologies, other than maybe Incredible Hulk and Fantastic Four. Most of them were Tales to Astonish, Journey into Mystery, Tales of Suspense, Strange Tales. Those are all collecting multiple stories within a comic.
Right.
And they would have a headline feature, and Thor was the headline of Journey into Mystery. And at a certain point, they have like the main story, and then they let Kirby do these backups, and it's just retelling Norse stories or Asgardian stories of like ancient Asgard. And you see like the Warriors 3 go on quests with Thor and Thor fighting.
So this ties into the lore as well, though.
Absolutely.
This fleshes out the world.
Yeah, so I don't know when that starts, but
that's interesting.
It's so...
I'd love to read
they're
some
so good. And honestly, I love a good Thor superhero. Like superhero stories with Thor fighting supervillains is great. I think one thing that makes this stand out from the Saturn Men of... or the Stone Men of Saturn...
Mm-hmm.
The fact that it is steeped in lore, steeped in mythology. You see Asgard, the Bifrost Bridge, all these gods and this kingdom of gods. It's just one of those big, massive set pieces,
right?
And storytelling things that Kirby was obsessed with.
Yeah, it's just some corner store, some important corners of the Marvel Universe being established here. Kyle, are both of these books essential, in your opinion?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
I think so. I think with certainly Journey 83 is. Certainly Journey 83. I mean, you really get a good introduction to Thor. I think with Loki... I think it establishes kind of the relationship. Although, you know what? I didn't look to see. Did he call him brother?
That's a good question. I'm not sure they established that yet.
I would have assumed yes, but I shouldn't assume that.
That might not be in
because there. That would be interesting if this doesn't establish that they're siblings yet. But because that to me... It's one of the reasons I would really like to read more Thor is because one thing that the MCU does very well, it's probably the best hero-villain relationship in the MCU.
It's one of the most developed, too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And part of that's because those two have been in the role for over a decade and they've had time. And Loki is one of the only villain characters to last this long.
Yeah.
But that kind of sibling dynamic is just so packed with drama and melodrama and
it's a great archetype, like the two brothers that hate each other.
Very Shakespearean.
Yeah,
like it feels like I know it's Norse mythology, but it just feels like a Shakespearean play of these two brothers who want to love each other but can't love each other because of who they are and how they fit into their world and the self-loathing that Loki feels and how Thor just brings out the worst in him, but also the best in him. I love that narrative arc And it's one of my favorite things. So I do think that starts here. Even though I'm not seeing the word brother show up, certainly that animosity is there. And I think if you want to follow that journey, I think you certainly aren't hurting yourself, even for the art alone.
Right. I mean, they're both Kirby issues.
Do you really want to go through life without once seeing Loki on a flock of pigeons?
It's,
you can only do that in
essential
comics.
Marvel combat is to summon your flock of pigeons.
I want to see Tom Hiddleston on a flock of pigeons.
It's fun seeing. I mean, like, we're cracking jokes at like how silly these stories are and stuff, but these like really are essential issues to the Marvel canon.
Well, and how inventive.
Yeah.
Not just fun. I mean, they're fun. They
are.
They don't shy away from being what they are, which is adventure science fantasy comics. I love that.
This issue in particular, more than the previous one, felt very inspired. There's a lot of like really inspired moments. Yeah, this is like Kirby firing at all cylinders.
Yeah, it's very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, like I said at the beginning of this section, I feel like you can tell Kirby just loves this subgenre of storytelling. All right. Carl, where can people find you online?
You can find me at carllucasdraws.com. I have an online store. I have a graphic novel called Shogun Bear and the House of Horrors. He's a samurai polar bear that fights ghosts and demons. Kyle, where can people find you at?
You can find me at ko-fi.com/Kyle Wendell for my mini comics and my comic Cornelius Armstrong, which is also about a bear, but this one is in the circus, and he's a strong man with a mustache. You can also follow me on Saturday Morning Comics, or Cartoon. I'm messing up my own brand, Carl. Saturday Morning Cartoonist on Instagram. And you can check out my art there. And otherwise, you can find us here next week, where we will cover episode 3.
Thanks for tuning in.
That's great. We're going to use that sign off.